Our scripture reading this morning will be taken from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
Happy Father's Day. I'd like to invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 8. We'll be reading this chapter together in just a moment. It's hard to put a value on the worth of fathers in the life of children. William Bennett made this very startling observation. 1/5 of all American children are raised in single-parent homes. And of those single-parent homes, 9 out of 10 children are raised by their mothers, most of whom, he said, do not even know or have never met their fathers. What a tragic commentary on the state of our union. How valuable are fathers, and what can we say about them? What does God reveal to us about them? I call your attention to Deuteronomy chapter 8, and as we read this passage together, let's remember this is the second of 3 sermons that Moses preached after the period of wandering in the wilderness. Israel is preparing to enter into the land of Canaan, and Moses delivers 3 speeches. This is right in the middle of that second sermon. And Moses is speaking on behalf of God. He said, every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land of which the Lord swore to your father. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years of the wilderness, to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell those 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and a thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your father did not know, that he might humble you, that he might test you, to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. As the nation which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. Isn't it interesting and enlightening that God designates himself, describes himself in terms of a father dealing with his children? And from this time forward, God describes himself as our Father which is in heaven, who provides for us. In fact, when you look at Deuteronomy chapter 8, there are many valuable lessons to be gleaned about fatherhood. What are fathers to be like? And you know, I'll just say this here before we begin our lesson. It's really sad to me that we're living in a time when these basic, fundamental principles about fatherhood have to be rehearsed. And unfortunately, they need to be rehearsed and rehearsed often, because we're seeing a generation come along that has no concept of fathers and of fatherhood and what fathers are to do. And many men who have fathered children biologically but in no other way, who certainly need to know their responsibility in bringing a human being into this world. So let's think about how God described himself as our Father. Number one, fathers provide for their children. Throughout this chapter, God reminded Israel how he had provided for them. He gave them food. He gave them clothing. He gave them protection. He gave them teaching and a law. God provided what they needed while they wandered in the wilderness. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8, Paul said, if a man does not provide for his own, neither for those of his own household, he's worse than an infidel and has denied the faith. What happened to a generation that seemed to have lost sight of these basic fundamental truths? We're seeing a generation come along today that's singing the praises of a socialist, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, who among other socialists says, we, the government, will provide all of your needs: food, clothing, shelter, protection, education, health care, whatever you need. The government is here with a blank check to fill it out and provide it for you. At least they say it's free. There's nothing free in this world. And when the government offers you something free, they're merely offering you something which belonged to someone else. That's all the government's doing. But again, that's the world we live in, where so many young people are looking to Bernie Sanders and people like him to say, we need to elect people like that to lead us, because we need the government to take care of us. We need men to shoulder the responsibility of fatherhood and provide for their families. That's what we need. What does a father provide? Well, a father provides food, clothing, shelter, protection. But a father provides teaching as well. And that's really the bulk of this chapter, isn't it? Yeah, God said, I gave you all those things, but primarily God said, I gave you all of those things so that you could listen to what I'm teaching you and you could obey my commandment. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Fathers, first and foremost, have a duty to teach their children about God and about living godly lives. William Bennett bemoans the fact that most of our households today are run by women in the absence of fathers. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but more times than not, it's just because the man is not shouldering his responsibility. And while we bemoan that fact with William Bennett, we also decry the fact that in the Lord's church, too many men are derelict in their duty when it comes to leading their homes and their families, spiritually speaking. I mean, where are the fathers when Sunday school rolls around, when worship rolls around, when it's time to be involved in evangelism, when it's time to help out with the Dorcas ministry or whatever we're doing? Where are the men in this congregation that will shoulder the responsibility and teach and show by example their children what it means to be a faithful servant of God in the kingdom of Christ? Too many of our men are absent. Something I'd like to observe about God's provisions. When you think about what Moses is saying here, he's describing God's provisions during 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Question, why were they wandering in the wilderness? Well, they misbehaved. They did not do as God said. They lacked faith in God, so he caused them to wander for 40 years. They were being punished. But in all of that 40-year period, while they were being punished, their shoes didn't wear out. Their feet didn't swell. They didn't have to worry about growing wheat and making bread. Bread miraculously appeared on the ground. When they needed meat, he would bring in a wind and bring birds into their camp, and they could eat to their full. Water would flow from a rock. God provided for them even when they were disobedient. And so do we as parents. You may say, well, I don't approve of the lifestyle of my child. Maybe not. But are you going to let them starve? Are you going to let them go without? If you do, I'm saying to you, you're doing something that God does not do. He does not treat his children that way. For 40 years they wandered, and God provided for them. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." And then he described what he meant by that. He sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. Those who deserve it, those who are good and obedient, and those who are not. But as our Father, he provides those things that we need. Number two, something we learn in Deuteronomy 8. A child's heart must be tested. And God repeated this, again, throughout this chapter. Think about it. Now, God could have simply spoken the word, and Israel would have miraculously appeared in the land of Canaan with all of the inhabitants simply gone. All of those cities intact. All of those vineyards planted. They wouldn't have had to unsheathe the first sword and go into any battle whatsoever, because God could have simply given it to them. Or he could have simply allowed the manna that he wanted for every family to have in their tents to just appear in their tents. Instead, he said, this is the manner in which you should go pick it up. This is the manner in which you should bring it into your homes to test them. Sometimes people complain that loving God would remove all sorrow and struggles and pain and heartache from our lives. But again, Moses makes it clear that God is testing our hearts. He's making us into the men and women we need to be by putting us through these tests. Remind me of what the Hebrew writer said, Hebrews 12. "My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness." God knows. And fathers, we need to recognize that challenges are necessary in order for growth to occur. In James chapter 1, for example, James says, "Count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith works patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be complete or perfect and entire, lacking nothing." What if we just gave our children everything they needed without them having to earn it or do anything for it? Well, we don't have to wonder what would be the outcome. We see, I have seen, what is the outcome of that. Spoiled brats who have no manners and no respect for anyone or anything and no appreciation for anything that they possess. Fathers, sometimes we need to let our children go without until they can learn to do for themselves. Much more valuable lesson than simply trying to convince your child you love them by giving them everything their heart may desire. Here's another thought from Deuteronomy chapter 8. And the Hebrew writer referenced this in Hebrews 12. We just read it. Where we respected our human fathers who corrected us, certainly God expected Israel to respect him. Verse 6, he speaks of this respect. Therefore, you shall keep my commandments. Therefore is a transitional thought. In light of all of these things that I've done for you, you should respect me. Fathers, like everyone else, desire to be respected. But let me say this, brothers. Respect in fatherhood is earned. It's not simply conferred. You can't simply say, well, I'm your father, therefore I demand that you respect me. And something else from Colossians 3:21. Paul said essentially the same thing he did in Ephesians chapter 6, but he said, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they be discouraged. The idea seemed to be that as fathers, perhaps in an effort to demand respect, we go overboard, we push too hard, we demand too much. We may send the message to our children, no matter what you do, you'll never satisfy me. You'll never attain the standard that I think you should attain. And so their hearts become discouraged. And if we're not careful, may push them so hard, they decide, what's the point? I can never please this man anyway, so I'm not even going to try. We have to be very careful when we're seeking and demanding that kind of respect. But certainly, we want to give fathers the respect that they deserve. There's another thought that comes from Deuteronomy 8. Success for our children is our goal. In the case of Israel, it was entering into the land of Canaan. This was God's goal for Israel. Now let's think about that for a moment. What is your goal for your child? What do you hope to see your child achieve in life? I suppose you could answer that question any number of ways. Well, I want them to be a very successful student. I could ask, okay, but why? Why do you want them to be a successful student? Well, I want them to have a successful career. And again, I would ask, why? Well, I want them to be able to make a lot of money. And again, I could ask the question, why? Well, what if they made all the money in the world and they were as successful as the world could esteem that goal to be? One day they're going to die. And they're not going to take anything with them, no more than they brought with them into this world. So how do you define success for your children? For God, it was, in this case, to bring them to the land of promise, the land of rest. As fathers, we may have goals of a secondary nature. We may want to teach our children a strong work ethic. We don't want you dependent on the government or anyone else. We want you to be able to work and fend for yourself. This is a lesson sorely lacking in our culture today. But certainly we need fathers to teach our children to be self-reliant, to fend for themselves. More than anything else, fathers have the duty to seek for their children, to see them become faithful children of God in His kingdom. What worthier goal could a human being strive for than to be a faithful child? You say, yeah, but if they're going to be a faithful child of God, it means they may miss out on some of the stuff in life. You know, when Jesus died, when He was murdered, He possessed one piece of clothing. It was a seamless garment, and the guards who were there watching over Him as He died, they bartered for, they cast lots to see who would get this one seamless garment. What did the Lord possess? What did He, quote unquote, achieve as far as the world's standards are concerned? Would we say that Jesus was a failure in His life? Certainly not. Again, fathers, we need to ask, what is our definition of success for our children. Another thought that comes from this text: as fathers, we will warn our children about the pitfalls and dangers that lie ahead in their life. Over and over in this chapter, God reminded Israel, when you come into the land of Canaan and you're dwelling in these houses you didn't build and you're eating from vineyards you didn't plant, be careful that your heart doesn't get full and to the point where you say to yourself, hey, you know, I did this. My power, my strength, my wisdom, it achieves all of this. And that you forget God who brought you here. Oh my. How America needs to be reminded how blessed we are indeed as a nation. But how did we achieve this success as a nation? Is it because we're smarter than other people? Better looking than other people? Wittier than other people? I like what we used to say, God bless America. That is the only thing we can say, honestly, to answer the question, how did we, in our short history, achieve so much? As far as the world is concerned, it's because God has been with us. But what's happened to us as a nation? Now that we have arrived, as it were, what do we see? Well, we see, I suppose, you can say just about anything except the gospel. You can believe just about anything except in God. I mean, it's insane what's happened to our culture in just a short period of time. So God is warning Israel of the danger to come. As fathers, we'll warn our children about the dangers and pitfalls that are ahead of them in life. Life is not always fair. And life can sometimes be very difficult. And our children need to be armed with adequate information to be prepared emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually for these pitfalls and dangers and obstacles along the way. Final thought that emerges from Deuteronomy 8 and is reminded of in Ephesians 6. Honor your father and your mother. A lot of people would be able to say to me now, or to any other preacher, but you don't know my father. He doesn't deserve my respect. You may not have the best parents in the world, but the instruction to children about honoring your father and mother is not conditioned on whether or not your father and mother were the kind of father and mother you deemed they should be, or whether they were living the kind of life God would have them to lead. But that is a commandment given to us as children, to honor our father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you, that you may live long on the earth. You want to prosper, do well, honor your father and your mother. It's appropriate, is it not, that as a nation we have set aside today as a day of honoring fathers, as we do honor mother. One of the things we learned in our Bible class this morning, Brother Hunter was reminding us so well about domestic duties and responsibilities. The best homes, brother, are those homes which are guided by Christian values and Christian principles. The best nations in the world are those nations whose homes primarily are Christian-oriented homes. What we need as a nation of people is to return to these simple, basic principles found in both the Old and New Testaments and apply them to our lives. What about you, Father? Are you living the kind of life before your children that you should live? Setting the proper example before them that you should set? Father's Day, like Mother's Day, can be a very emotionally challenging day. Many in this audience have already lost your father. Many of you, no doubt, have fond memories of your father. Wish you could roll back the hand of time and be with your father yet again. Let's cherish the memories of our fathers, the time that we spend with them. And if our fathers are still alive, let's take advantage of the opportunity to be with them, spend time with them, listen to them, share our lives with them. John said in 1 John chapter 3, "Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God." What a great and exalted privilege that is. To be able to call God in heaven our Father. Know that we are members of His household with special rights and privileges associated with that. You could be a member of the household of God yourself today through simple gospel obedience, doing those things that God has required to become a member of His precious body. Believing Jesus is the Son of God, repenting of sin, confessing faith in Him, being buried in the grave of baptism for the remission of sins, to rise to walk in newness of life. If that is your need, and we can assist you in any way, please make that need known right now while together we stand as we sing.